Welcome to the Come and Clear workshop, which is about transforming anxiety and stress and panic into joy. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we're gathered. We're all gathered in different places. So we'll just recognise all the various traditional custodians of the various places where we're gathered. And to begin with, I'd just like to say that we're all equal and all in this together. I'd like to encourage you to get comfortable. If you need to go to the nearest amenities, you can do so. Just you don't need to signal that you're popping off to use the amenities, just do so. But I will leave space for breaks throughout so that we don't become fatigued. So you're likely here because you have anxiety or panic and want to better manage it. You want to learn how to cope with stress, or you're interested in mindfulness in general, or you're a joy junkie, because this workshop is about transforming negative feelings and thoughts into joy, which is always a good thing. Oh, sorry. Just a little bit about me. You guys probably all know I'm the Associate Chaplain with USQ's Multi-Faith Service. So I'm the Buddhist Chaplain. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Publishing at USQ. I've been a Buddhist practitioner for 4 decades. So I began as a practitioner when I was 11. And I have a past history with severe anxiety and panic. And some of you probably already know this, but I'll just repeat it for those of you who don't. At the age of 19, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. And I lived with those things for a very long time. I currently do not have any of those things anymore because I applied the processes that we're going to talk about today, after having tried lots of other things, including, seeing, I think, 4 or 5 therapists, a psychiatrist, and a number of different medications, none of which worked and most of which actually made it worse. Okay, so this is a quote from Siddhartha Gautama, who we call the Buddha, which means the awakened one. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, created by mind. So I'm just sharing that quote with you because it indicates how thought is primary, how the mind is primary in our experience. This means, of course, that how we think matters. Accepting the primacy of mind and thought is really important. We really need to accept that the way we think about things influences the way we experience things. And the thing about negative thinking is that those negative thinking patterns self-perpetuate, and they have a really deeply harmful impact on our emotional and physical well-being. There's a huge amount of research that shows that negative thinking patterns, negative kind of perspectives impact not just how we feel in terms of our well-being, but also our immunity, our blood pressure, and obviously elevated blood pressure for an extended period of time can lead to problems with our heart, including arrhythmias and stuff like that. So this all comes from mind. Mind is the source of all of that negative thinking. That negative thinking then can have quite negative emotional and physical impact on our bodies. And obviously the downside to that is the longer we think in negative ways, the more negative we become and the more physically ill we feel. The upside, we can change the way we think and thus change the way we feel. So in the same way that negative thinking patterns can really deeply impact our bodies in a quite harmful way, and obviously completely undermine our well-being, positive thinking, and I don't like using that phrase because I'm not really talking about positive thinking actually, but thoughts that are not negative or that are not based on a misperception of reality can actually be very beneficial for us. They can actually reduce blood pressure, increase the way we feel, the positive feelings we have in terms of our experience of the world. Even there's a boost to immunity that happens. It slows down the aging process. There's all kinds of positive benefits. And if any of you have done the meditation course that's available online that I teach, there's a really long list of scientific articles there that show the benefits of meditation, which I'm happy to share with you at another time. All right. So today we're going to talk about, usually this workshop, when it's done face-to-face, I talk about a much more wider range of things. But today I'm just going to really zoom in on this process called RAIN. RAIN is an ancient, it's a lot of ancient Buddhist ideas, 2,000 years old, probably longer, actually 2,500, something like that, years old ideas that a Buddhist practitioner and psychologist in the United States called Tara Brach, she has condensed them all into this neat little package so that it's really quite easy to use these Buddhist ideas without having a really deep understanding or a sort of expending a huge amount of time doing the reading and doing the various kind of studies and practices that you would need to do to kind of come to this point, to understand this stuff. So she's collated all this Buddhist information into this one really quite potent little package. And this is not exactly the process that I did when I was working with my own anxiety and panic, but it is close enough for me to feel confident that this will work in the same way. So RAIN stands for recognize, accept, investigate, and non-dual or non-duality or non-dualism, depending on where you see it reprinted. Some of you will have heard of this before. Some of you might not have done so. So for me, and this is not the way Tara Brach teaches it, but this is the way that I think it's best applied, you need to do two kinds of RAIN, two RAIN processes. One is a kind of like a prep RAIN, one that you do in a calm moment. So you choose a time of day every single day when you are at your least anxious. Everyone's anxiety and panic and stress comes in waves. There's always a point at which it's at its lowest and another point where it's at its highest. If you have generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder or really quite intense stress or other negative emotions like anger, sadness, stuff like that, they always come in these waves. There's a definite pattern to them. However, sometimes it's a little bit random. So you might not have, like something might happen that means that it completely throws out your normal kind of a rhythm. But for me, what I found was there were two moments in my day when I was at my least anxious. Now, if you have generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder, you're always anxious. It's free floating. It's 24/7. So you're not looking for a time when there's no anxiety, because if you have generalized anxiety disorder, that's impossible. But there is always a time when it's at its weakest. And for me, that was the first hour of every day. So I'd wake up and I'd have about an hour where I felt more or less okay, and then it would start to hit. And also in the shower or bath. So those were kind of that, for me, bathing and showering were kind of comfort behaviors. And so I was at my least anxious in those times. So those are the times that I chose to do my work on my anxiety and on my panic. You can choose the time that works for you best, but you do need to choose one time in each day to work on this. And if you don't have like a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder or anything like that, you can use this just to generally improve your well-being, because you don't need a serious diagnosis for this to be of benefit to you. Okay, so the first one in the RAIN process is recognize. Now, these are things that I've come up with. These are not from Tara Brach, and this is because she doesn't do a sort of a prep version of this, but I've done this myself. And these are the things that I would do in my quiet moment, and I would journal these things. You don't have to journal these things, but it's actually very useful to journal these things, because then you can look back on them later and remind yourself of the work you've already done, and then it has a cumulative impact. That's actually really quite important. A number of Buddhist masters have said to me over the years, our biggest problem is forgetting. We forget the progress we've made. We forget what we've learned. And so journaling helps us to work against the forgetting. So we always remember where we've been, what we understand about ourselves. It doesn't sort of fall into that miasma of the deep memory. So in a calm moment, recognize the impermanence of all mind states and physical sensations. So as a Buddhist, I don't know if you guys are Buddhists, and you don't really need to be a Buddhist to recognize the truth of impermanence. All things are impermanent. If you can show me something that is not impermanent, I'll be flabbergasted. All things are subject to change over time. Very few things last very long. And the mind states that we feel, we experience, anxiety, panic, stress, these are deeply impermanent, like more impermanent than physical things. The mind of all things is the most impermanent. Everything that passes through the mind is very fleeting. It seems continuous because we're not really looking, we're not really paying attention. But when you look and when you pay attention, you really see that all mind states and physical sensations are very fleeting. They come and go. Why is this important for a person with anxiety, panic, or stress? Any negative emotion like anger, sadness, it's because it tells you these mind states, no matter how severe they are, no matter how awful they are, they will pass. Often, when you have a diagnosis of anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, you start to you think, and it's a part of the pattern, that these are permanent states, you know, and that perpetuates those states, belief in their permanence. So you have to kind of undermine that belief in the permanence of those states by recognizing that they're impermanent. It's really, really important. Then you need to recognize the nature of the negative thought patterns you've been experiencing. So when you're having a negative thought pattern, what is it? Is it anxious? Is it panicked? Is it fearful? Is it sad? Is it angry? Recognize the nature of the negative thought patterns you've been experiencing. I think it's also a good idea to give them general labels like anxiety, panic, stress, anger, just so you can, having a label in this context is a good thing. Often labels are not good things, but in this context, it works in your favor. And then recognize the core beliefs that fuel these negative thoughts. Remember, you're journaling this, so you're sort of writing this all down. Negative thought patterns do not come from nowhere. As a Buddhist, and it doesn't really matter if you're a Buddhist or not, but this is true if you're a Buddhist or not. All things have a cause. No thing magically appears. There is nothing in the universe that magically appears. All things have causes and conditions. Both of those things need to be in place, the causes and the conditions for a thing to emerge, for it to arise. So the negative thought patterns that you've been experiencing, the anxiety, the panic, the causes for those negative thought patterns are certain conditions, which we might in the West call triggers, but also really fundamentally, the causes are these core beliefs that fuel those negative thoughts. So you might not really be able to deal with the triggers, particularly if, like for me, the trigger seemed to be just being alive. It was like everything triggered me. So, but you can deal with the core beliefs, and then the triggers no longer trigger anything. So you need to recognize the core beliefs that fuel those negative thought patterns. So if you're feeling stressed, what's the belief underneath that fuels the stress? And it seems like quite mundane, but all moments of stress in a workplace are underscored by some kind of belief, and it's usually a belief of like inadequacy, incompetence, or some kind of sense that there's not enough time, that we don't have time. Those are core beliefs, and you can recognize those, and by recognizing them, you can then start to work on them. Then also recognize what your worst case scenario is. What do you think is going to happen? So when you're having a negative thought pattern, like when you're feeling anxious or panicked or angry or sad, what is the worst case scenario arising out of that core belief and that thought pattern? So for example, a lot of people who have anxiety, their core beliefs are all different, but when they're feeling anxiety, they interpret the physical symptoms that come with anxiety, which is the fight or flight response, right? They interpret those physical symptoms as evidence that they're going to have a heart attack or stroke. That's a very common worst case scenario for people with anxiety and panic, even stress actually. So you need to know what your worst case scenario is. It'll always be different. Everyone will have a different set of core beliefs, different thought patterns, and different worst case scenarios. So you need to know what yours is. And why do you need to know what your worst case scenario is? Again, so that you can work against it, so that you can teach yourself that that worst case scenario is not likely to happen, which we'll come to a little bit later. And also you need to recognize how you use avoidance behaviors to cope. I've got an and there. I'm not sure why, but how you use avoidance behaviors to cope. And avoidance behaviors, that's probably why that and is there, because I deleted something. And avoidance behaviors includes things like alcohol, drugs, other kinds of addictive avoidance behaviors. Okay, so what kind of avoidance behaviors do you use to cope? Now, avoidance behaviors, in a short-term way, when you're in a peak stress environment that you know is going to pass, distracting oneself is not a bad thing. It's actually quite beneficial. When avoidance behaviors become entrenched and it becomes like a organizing principle of your life, then it becomes a problem, because it starts to really impinge on your ability to enjoy your life. For example, people who have anxiety will often avoid going out in public because they don't want to have a panic attack or an anxiety attack in public. So they avoid going out in public. People who have anger issues, they will avoid the things that trigger their anger. And that's probably a good thing in the short term, but in the long term, it might mean that they're not actually dealing with the anger. They're just avoiding the situation. And so the negative emotion, it just sort of continues to simmer underneath. So you need to recognize how you use avoidance behaviors to cope. And the reason we do that is so that we can then start to actually challenge those avoidance behaviors as well. All right, so that's recognize. Again, this is the recognize in the preparing moment, when we're preparing for when we do have a panic attack. If we don't prepare, if we try to apply RAIN when we're having panic, when we're having anxiety, when we're in the midst of stress, it won't really work. So we need to prepare in a calm moment so that we can then apply it in the anxious moment so that it will work. Okay, accept. That's the A part of the RAIN. So again, in a quiet moment, your least stressful moment for the day, you need to accept, you need to work on accepting these things. That anxiety and panic and its associated physical symptoms are not indications of something fundamentally wrong. They're not indications of something fundamentally wrong with you, and they're not indications of something fundamentally wrong with the world. Okay? Particularly the physical symptoms. This is a big one. If you have anxiety or panic or even stress, this triggers the fight or flight response. And for a lot of people, they don't recognize the fight or flight response for what it is. Because they're already anxious and they're panicked, they're looking for something to hang that anxiety and panic on, and then the physical symptoms occur, and they think, "Oh, I'm having a heart attack. I'm having a stroke," or they just see it as symptoms of impending worse anxiety, impending worse panic, which sort of triggers actually worse anxiety and worse panic. So it's not a good thing. So you need to accept that anxiety and panic and its associated physical symptoms are not actually indications of something fundamentally wrong. They're just disordered thinking, disordered feeling. That's it. There's nothing fundamentally wrong. Okay? You also need to accept that anxiety and panic are not a part of who you are. They are temporary mind states triggered by negative beliefs and negative thoughts. Now, sometimes the negative thinking patterns and the anxiety and panic are actually triggered by the physical symptoms, the fight or flight response, because when you are in a constant state of anxiety or panic or stress, you do find that the physical symptoms, the fight or flight response, is very, very easily triggered and often non-consciously triggered. So we're not consciously aware of those things having been triggered. We just suddenly go, "Oh, I'm feeling a bit weird. My palms are sweaty. I'm feeling a bit dizzy. My eyes are a bit blurry." And then we go, "Oh, I'm having a heart attack," or whatever your thing happens to be, But actually, when you have long-term anxiety and panic, the fight or flight symptoms can happen quite randomly out of the blue. It's not random, but it can seem random. There is a cause, but you're not conscious of the cause. So you really need to address that physical symptom thing, that this is just the fight or flight response. It's actually completely normal. It's not going to hurt you, and they're not symptoms. It's not an indication of something fundamentally wrong. And then anxiety and panic are not a part of who you are. One of the major obstacles to overcoming anxiety and panic is the idea that a lot of anxious and panicked people have is that it's fundamental to who they are, that they're somehow broken, that this is just who they are. This is not true. It is not true. Anxiety and panic are not fundamental to anyone's nature. They're temporary. They're just mind states. They're triggered by negative beliefs and negative thoughts. You also need to accept that you can overcome those negative mind states and that avoidance doesn't work. So if you think that anxiety and panic or anger or stress are a fundamental part of your being, because of your childhood or because of something else, they're a fundamental part of my being, if you accept that, you actually are not accepting that they can be changed. You're saying to yourself, these things cannot be changed. These are a fundamental part of myself. As a Buddhist, we would suggest there's nothing fundamental to who you are. Nothing at all. Not even your memories. These things are not fundamental to who you are at all. So you need to let them go. Or at least let go of the idea that that these negative things, these very negative things, are intrinsic to who you are. You also need to accept that avoidance doesn't work. So avoiding triggers doesn't work. Obviously, if your triggers create intense states that are very unpleasant, yes, avoid the triggers until you've got to a point where you can safely and comfortably start to face the things that you've been avoiding. And you do that in a very slow process. I actually think working on the core beliefs means that those triggers actually dissolve by themselves. And you don't really need to actually face them directly. But sometimes you'll have some lingering stuff that will trigger a weaker version of what you used to have. And then in those situations, you might need to actually start to face your triggers. But that's something that you might need help doing. But you don't need assistance to face the core beliefs and to undermine those. And then usually 99% of the time, the triggers will dissolve by themselves. But it really is important that you understand that avoidance actually doesn't work. Avoidance behaviors they reinforce the negative thought pattern and the core belief. Because if you start to feel anxious and then you avoid the thing that's making you anxious, you tell yourself that thing is the cause of my anxiety, when actually it's not. The core belief is the cause of your anxiety. You need to undermine that. And also, when you drink alcohol or take drugs to deal with stress, and of course it works, you then reinforce for yourself that this is the thing that works for my anxiety, rather than working with it and removing it. All right, you also need to accept that you have to put in the work to overcome anxiety and panic. No one can cure your anxiety for you. Unfortunately, the Western medical system and even the Western psychological system, it rests on this idea that we need help. And yes, we do need help, but there are also a lot of things that we can do on our own, and there are many things that we can't do except for on our own. For example, if you're overweight, which I am a little overweight, you need to do the things yourself. No one can actually make you exercise. No one can make you eat well. Same with anxiety. No one can make you calm. You have to do that yourself. It's really something that we need to take on board. We have to do the work, and this is the work. Every day, 10 to 15 minutes, prepare, and then when the anxiety strikes, we apply rain as well, which we'll come to in a minute. The next bit is investigate. So you need to investigate, is the core belief feeding your negative thought patterns true? I've never encountered someone for whom the answer to that question is yes. The core belief feeding your negative thought patterns is almost certainly, I will just say, the core belief patterns feeding your negative thoughts is untrue. It's untrue. I've never encountered something that's true. You also need to investigate, are the negative thoughts true or even accurate? Remember, you're journaling this, so you're writing this all down. Use evidence and logic to undermine the core belief in negative thought patterns. So in this case, I think I gave this example to Sharon the other day. If your anxiety is, I'm going to have a heart attack, right? You use that as you look at that and go, okay, I have had an anxiety attack every day for like 20 years. Have I ever had a heart attack? No, you have not. So you use the evidence there. You also use logic to undermine the core belief and negative thought patterns. So sometimes people have core belief patterns like they're undeserving, they're fundamentally flawed, they're fundamentally weak, stuff like that. It's really quite intense stuff. None of those things are true of any being. And the thing I also often say is, think of someone you really, really love and ask yourself, would you level that kind of criticism at them? Would you say to someone else that you love, you're undeserving, you're fundamentally weak? You know, we wouldn't do it. We just wouldn't do it. So why is it okay to hold that belief about ourselves? It's really not okay, actually. So you need to undermine it. The only way to let go of it is to undermine it. Saying let go of it, let go of it, let go of it won't do a thing. You need to actually use evidence and logic to undermine it. So you need to identify what it is, your core belief, and then undermine it. You undermine both the core belief and the negative thinking patterns. So in states of anxiety, you might be thinking, oh, I'm going to freak out, I'm going to freak out, I'm going to humiliate myself in public. Use the evidence that you have to determine if that's likely. Usually it's not. Most people with anxiety rarely have, you know, full-blown panic attacks and stuff like that in the situations that they don't want to, because they're avoiding. So it rarely happens. And the other thing is, even if it does, you know, what's your worst case scenario? If your worst case scenario is, I'm going to have a full-blown panic attack in public, you know, what's the worst case scenario? If that is it, so what? So what if you do? A lot of this stuff is about shame. So we don't want to panic in public. We don't have anxiety in public. We don't want to make fools of ourselves in public. But really, if you do, so what? What's the big deal? In reality, what is likely to happen is people will help you, or they won't notice, or if they do notice, they won't care. It's very unlikely that that you will have a really fully 100% negative experience. Usually if you do, sometimes people feel so unwell from the fight or flight response that, they need desperately to lie down in public, and they really don't want to do that, so they avoid being in public. But then if you do just lie down and feel, people will say, are you okay? You say, oh, I'm actually not feeling great, and they'll help. So often our avoidance behaviors, they rob us of help, of people coming to our aid. So it's really kind of interesting. But usually the worst case scenario won't happen. Use logic about that. Is the worst case scenario likely? 9 times out of 10, it is not likely. And if the worst happens, so what? If that 1 out of 10 times it actually happens, so what? It actually doesn't really matter. We put so much weight on these scenarios when in effect, they don't really mean anything. Think about yourself. If you were in a public place and someone was having a panic attack or fainted or felt unwell, what would you do? Would you think, oh, what a loser? No, you wouldn't think that. You would think, oh, poor person. And you probably would help. If you didn't help, you would at least want to help. So remember that. Now the next one is, is a little bit Buddhist-y, but I think it's important. So Tara Brach, when she uses the N one, we'll have a break after this. Tara Brach, when she uses the N in RAIN here, she calls it non-duality or non-dual. I actually think that is not a very effective use of that N, because non-dual states are really rare. Most people don't really know what that means, and most people they would only have a very theoretical sense of that. But when you use nature of mind, I think it's a bit more affirming. So in this one, we need to convince ourselves, I suppose, of these things or understand these things. And that is that mind in its natural state is calm and clear like water. That's the name of the workshop. Thoughts and feelings are like waves on a deep ocean. They rise, peak, and then dissolve naturally. So you don't need to do anything for thoughts and feelings to dissolve. We are intervening because we've got a pattern of a problem, but actually they dissolve naturally anyway. What we're doing is intervening so they dissolve more quickly, but they will dissolve anyway. It's important to really understand that they're completely impermanent. They rise, they have a peak, so there's a moment where they're at their worst, and then they dissolve naturally. So it's really important to be able to, and knowing this means we get a sense of being able to ride that wave. There will be an end to this, and we also recognize where the peak is. You know, we go, okay, they do rise, they do peak, and then they dissolve. So once we begin to understand that, we then sense where the peak is, and then we recognize when it started to ebb off. And that's a great reassurance. We go, okay, it's beginning to pass. And that really helps us in the moment. But we need to have this understanding outside of the moment, so we need to prepare. We also need to understand that no matter how turbulent the surface, in the depths, all is calm. No amount of negative thinking affects the true nature of the mind. The ocean depths are unaffected by the waves on the surface. So we would say this about the nature of mind, that it is stainless, that there's nothing that you can do that affects it in a negative way. Also, you can't make it better. You can't enrich it. It is perfect already. This is very Buddhist-y, so bear with me. But I think this is helpful, even if you're not a Buddhist. The nature of the mind is perfect already. It can't be stained by anything you do, and it can't be made any more perfect. It's already completely perfect. So nothing you do impacts on what we call your fundamental goodness. This idea of fundamental goodness is really important in Buddhism, and I think, you know, even if you're not a Buddhist, it's a really important idea that we're fundamentally good. Not that we have to work to be good, not that we have to try to be good, not that we have to do things to be good. We are actually, in our natures, fundamentally good. Okay? Now, I won't go into. There's some things that if you're kind of like well versed in Western philosophy, that might pop up there that you want to just, you know, challenge or something. But we'll just leave it there. We won't talk about it here because I think actually that is a bit of a distraction. But it's important to accept our fundamental nature is good. We have fundamental goodness at our heart. Buddhists also call this Buddha nature, which means we have the potential for enlightenment. Enlightenment, stripped of all religious stuff, just means to be 100% sane, to have no inhibitions, you know, to have no fear, to have no anger, to have no hatred, no cruelty, but to have the full weight of compassion, loving kindness, generosity, joy. So that's what we mean when we say enlightened, to be 100% sane. Okay, so the other important thing to know is that fundamental goodness, or that perfect calmness, is always underneath, always reachable. In fact, the Buddhist metaphor to describe this perfect calm, this fundamental goodness, and how easy it is to reach, is that it's closer than our eyelashes. So that's you know, an important thing to remember, that calm, it is as close as your eyelashes, which means really bloody close. So we want to work at recognizing that we can touch that calm when we need to, because that will comfort us when we start to feel anxious or panic or stressed. And then if we trust that we can touch that calm, we will be able to touch that calm. It's interesting. Doubt undercuts your ability to touch base with calm. If you doubt that you can touch base with calm, you actually won't be able to. So it's really important in moments of relative peace, you know, when you're not too stressed out or anxious, to really work on these things and to understand that you can touch base with that calm. So in their nature, thoughts and feelings, even negative ones, are of the same nature as the deeper mind. You know how I was talking about the pure nature of mind, this fundamental goodness? I'll do a little bit of Buddhist stuff here just very quickly. So in Buddhism, we think about the mind as having two basic, I mean, it has many more aspects, but two basic aspects. One is what we call dualistic mind, which is where all the thinking happens, where all the thoughts and feelings happen, and where all the perceptions happen, and all the ideas and all that stuff. that stuff is actually what we identify as ourselves, but is actually not ourselves. Underneath that, and actually giving rise to that stuff, giving us the potential to have thoughts and feelings, is the deeper nature of mind, or what we call the true nature of mind. And it has only one real quality, and that is compassion. But it also has this other interesting thing. When you touch base with it, it triggers physical bliss and joy. So it has these characteristics only: physical bliss and joy and compassion. That's it. There's nothing else there. So because all this stuff, including the negative stuff, is rising from that, what we might call ground or basis or fundamental heart, of your mind, of your being, these thoughts and stuff, they rise from there, which means in the same way that waves are of the same nature as the ocean, all the thoughts and feelings we have are of the same nature as that deeper part of mind, which we've already described that as what? Fundamentally good. Perfect already. It's only the dualistic mind that interprets these things as negative. So it's a slightly hard thing to grasp, and we're just talking about experiences in the mind. We're not talking about behaviors. There are harmful behaviors. Not all behaviors are not perfect, definitely not. There are harmful behaviors, but harmful behaviors come from negative thought patterns that are themselves, if you recognize them, of the same nature of the deeper part of the mind. As soon as you recognize them as being of that nature, they actually dissolve. As soon as you recognize their true nature, that they're not this negative thing, that actually it's just the energy of the fundamental nature of mind, they dissolve, they just vanish. And then there's no possibility of a negative behavior coming from it because it's gone. And what is in its place when you recognize its true nature? Bliss and compassion. That's what's left. So that's what I mean when we talk about this workshop being transforming these negative things into joy, because that's what happens when you recognize their nature. So not everyone's going to be able to recognize the nature of these things and have them dissolve immediately. That will take some time to achieve, but it is definitely, you can trust, or you might not want to trust me, but trust this. If you give it a crack, you'll find this out for yourself. They do, when you see their nature, dissolve these supposedly negative things, and they leave in their absence just joy. It's really rather amazing. Okay, so, and knowing that underneath that distressing experience is fundamentally something joyful is actually really reassuring as well. So, and I'll talk about, we'll have a little break now, and then we'll talk about how to apply RAIN in the moment of stress, in the moment of anxiety, and in the moment of panic, because we've done this preparation, and then so the next time we have a panic attack or an anxiety attack, or we want to hit our boss over the head with a bottle because we're super stressed, we'll be able to apply RAIN, and we'll save the boss's life, and we'll dissolve our anxiety, and we'll also dissolve our panic. Okay, so we'll have a little bit of a break, and I'll come back and talk about the next level of stuff. Okay, any questions or comments?
Well, my one comment was when you were talking about enlightenment. I didn't take notes and I don't remember all the different things you said to describe it. But one thing that I've read from a Buddhist practitioner in describing enlightenment was that it was living without judgment. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So
I found that very useful because I can be quite judgy, and you have to say, stop judging other people. Or if you look at them and something judgmental comes into your mind, transform it into something perhaps positive instead of negative.
Indeed.
It's a hard practice.
Yeah, so when I was saying that enlightenment is just 100% sanity, that would include obviously things like judgment. They are not there in an enlightened mind. Another way that they describe it in Tibet, in the Tibetan system, they would say that an enlightened person is a person who is 100% comfortable in 100% of all situations. So they're just at ease. That phrase, at ease, is used a lot. And an amazing Tibetan master, teacher from, I think what are we talking, the 12th century, don't quote me, called Longchenpa. He said that fundamentally the practice is to rest at ease. So that's really what we're about. It's about, and other lamas, many lamas, teachers, that is, meditation masters, really heavily focus on this idea of just resting. And the reason that is a focus is because of what I was talking about. The fundamental goodness at the heart of us is obscured by all the stuff we do, all the busyness, all activity. It's never gone, it's never diminished, but it's obscured. We don't see it and others don't see it, and we don't act from it. So to just rest at ease in that fundamental goodness means that that's all that there is. We don't have to do anything, actually. The fundamental goodness is just there if we just stop all the other stuff and just rest. It's really very interesting. Okay, so I think that is the end. Anything else anyone else wants to say? No? Okay, so I think we'll stop the first part of the workshop there, and we'll begin the next part, which is how to apply RAIN in a moment of stress, anxiety, or panic. And so we'll just have a brief pause, and then we'll start that.